Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Forest Space. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's event, Shame, Sex, Attraction. This is a conversation with Dr. Lucas F.W. Wilson. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and we respect the continued connections with the past, the present, and future, and our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Here at Forest Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge, co-creating daily activities that examine research questions and projects in development across the university. We are running today's event as a live stream both to YouTube and via Zoom, so those of you joining us there, if you have any comments or questions a little later on, just pop those into the chat and we can read them out. And for those of you here in the space, if you have any comments or questions, just let us know and we'll run a microphone around to you so that everyone can hear. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our co-hosts. This afternoon, we have Dr. Casey Burkholder, who's a Canada Research Chair in Social Justice and Youth and Child Studies here at Concordia, and Dr. Celeste E, or the Wendy J. Robbins Professor in Gender and Women's Studies and the Director of the Gender and Women's Studies Program at the University of New Brunswick. Casey, Celeste, it's great to have you.
Thank you so much for having us. Good afternoon, everyone. As we're about to talk about experiences of harm and of gender and sexuality and the political, I also want to offer a territorial acknowledgement that gets us started in a good way. So we acknowledge that we're gathered here today on the traditional and unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, recognized as the caretakers of the lands and waters here in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. This land has long been a place of meeting, exchange, and relationship building for many First Nations, and continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples and other communities. So as we take a moment to reflect on this land and its histories, we want to recognize that issues of gender, sexuality, consent, and bodily autonomy have been deeply impacted by colonial systems that have sought to regulate Indigenous people and communities, identities, and knowledges. In the context of our work in gender and sexuality studies, and today as we meet to talk about legacies of conversion therapy and harms, we want to commit to acknowledging and challenging these colonial legacies by centering care-forward, justice-based approaches that honor Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and relating. We respect the enduring connection between peoples, lands, genders, and generations, and we seek to build better relationships rooted in accountability, reciprocity, and care. Thank you.
So we're delighted to welcome you all here today, today's event, Shame, Sex, Attraction, and we're very privileged to have Dr. Lucas Wilson here at a distance to discuss his new short story anthology, Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivors' Stories of Conversion Therapy, published this year by Jessica Kingsley Publishers. The book brings together 17 stories about conversion therapy written by survivors themselves, including Wilson. With a foreword by New York Times bestselling author Gerard Conley, the book gives voice to a number of LGBTQ+ related themes and experiences, especially in and from high control religious contexts. To date, Shame, Sex, Attraction has received praise from reviewers like those at Publishers Weekly, and you can see and hear Wilson talk about Shame, Sex, Attraction, obviously here today, but during his recent appearance on the LGBTQ+ podcast and YouTube channel, Queer Collective. Before we begin this discussion, we will introduce Luke and ourselves. I'm Celeste Orr, an Associate Professor of Sociology and the Wendy J. Robbins Professor in Gender and Women's Studies at the University of New Brunswick. And I was very fortunate enough to meet Luke at McMaster University, where we were both graduate students in the English and Cultural Studies department at the same time. To be honest, I didn't know Luke all that well. During our 1 year where we were at Mac together, our paths crossed, but we were enrolled in different classes and we were allotted different graduate student offices, and we seemed to have different or divergent social lives. I learned later, while we were at Mac together, Luke was unpacking his experiences of being subjected to conversion therapy during his undergraduate career. I regret not getting to know Luke sooner, yet since our time at McMaster, we have kept in touch, we've become good friends, and Luke has graciously and generously shared his story with me, my students, and with the world through his scholarship and activism. And I'm very honored that I get to call Luke my friend and colleague. and I'm grateful to him for all the lessons he has imparted, including but not limited to the lessons in his recent book, which I encourage everyone to get from their local libraries or buy from their local, preferably queer-owned bookshops. Oh, it's still me.
It is.
So Dr. Lucas Wilson is a Shirk postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and was formerly the Justice, Equity, and Transformation postdoctoral fellow at the University of Calgary. In addition to editing Shame, Sex, Attraction, he is the co-editor of Emerging Trends in Third-Generation Holocaust Literature and the author of At Home with the Holocaust, Post-Memory, Domestic Space, and Second-Generation Holocaust Literature, which received the Jordan Schnitzer First Book Publication Award. His public-facing writing has appeared in The Advocate, Quarty, LGBTQ Nation, and Religion Dispatches, among other venues. He's currently working on a new edited collection about queer experiences at Christian colleges, universities, and seminaries, which is under contract with University of Georgia Press.
Hey, everybody. I'm Casey Burkholder. I'm a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Social Justice and Youth and Child Studies in the Department of Education here at Concordia. I'm a bisexual femme, and I previously worked at the University of New Brunswick, where I first met Celeste. My work sits at the intersection of activism, gender, sexuality, DIY media making, art, queer joy, and participatory archiving. I engage in research for social change using participatory visual methods, mostly with 2S LGBTQ+ youth, adults, elders, and teachers to address local issues. I serve as the director of the Joy Lab here at Concordia, and I'm the principal investigator of Prideswell Plus and Sexuality NB, two Shirk-funded research projects on gender and sexuality. I'm so excited to be here today to speak with Celeste and Lucas, who I haven't had the pleasure to meet in person, and I'm just meeting right now online, and who is a delight. And I'm excited to get to know better alongside you all this afternoon. So for those of you joining us here in the Force Space, we have brought some crafting supplies if you'd like to collage, doodle, write, or busy your hands as you listen to our conversation. We welcome you to use the supplies at the back of the room however you see fit. We also encourage everybody, those attending in person and virtually, to make yourselves as comfy as possible. Eat a snack, get up and stretch, take a break, walk around if you need to. We recognize that any discussion about conversion therapy can be troubling. So please do whatever it is you need to take care of yourself and make yourself comfortable. We've crafted some questions for Luke to start the conversation. And after we've posed our questions, we're going to open up the floor to the audience to ask their own questions. Thank you.
Hey, Luke. I'm going to ask the first question. I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about what conversion therapy is, because often folks can have a really narrow understanding of what it means and what the practices are, and also who practices it. Additionally, in your book, you note that the term conversion therapy is a misnomer, and I'm wondering if you could explain to us all why this is the case.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is an absolute pleasure. Although not there in person, I'm super excited to be in conversation with everyone, chatting with you two wonderful folks. And again, thank you for the invitation. So to answer your question, Celeste, conversion therapy at its core, when we're talking about conversion therapy or conversion practices, we're talking about efforts to change an individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or gender expression. And so these practices run the gamut, right? There's a range of what constitutes conversion practices. If we're talking about specifically conversion therapy, we're talking oftentimes about a programmatic sort of effort to change an individual's gender or sex, right? And obviously a non-normative gender or sex. If we're talking about conversion practices, these are practices that go beyond just the realm of conversion therapy, though of course they define conversion therapy, but conversion practices are anything that communicate to an individual that it's not okay to be a gender or sexual minority. Right. So this could be something as simple as, a parent saying to their kid, hey, little boy, don't be playing with that doll. That's your sister's. Put that away. That's not for you. A little girl, hey, you shouldn't be playing with that truck, whatever. For kids who are, young boys who are playing in their sister's closets and, putting on their makeup. I'm talking about my own biography. I mean, this is, some I guess, actions or activities that would not be considered okay for a young boy to do. And then having a parent, thank God I didn't have a parent like this, but having a parent say, hey, you shouldn't be doing that, right? So this is sort of messaging that accumulates over time. And, there's also obviously not just messaging, but also physical sort of manifestations, communicating to folks that it's not okay to be a certain gender or sex or sexuality. And as a result, again, these are what we call conversion practices, efforts to change people, messages, passed on to people, whether it be, and again, it could be something like a kid being bullied in school, being beaten up for, doing whatever he or she or they are doing, that again, does not align with the heteronormative model. So these are conversion practices, again, not just within the confines of conversion therapy, but obviously defining conversion therapy. And if we're talking about conversion practitioners, this can really be anyone, right? Like it can be any parent, it could be any guardian, it can be any teacher, it can be any, religious leader, whomever, right? That or whoever that communicates to someone that it's not okay to be who they are as it relates to their gender and sexuality. But if we're talking about conversion therapists specifically, conversion therapy today is really happening disproportionately within high control Christian contexts. Conversion therapy doesn't have its roots or origins in religious context. It actually comes from the medical and psychiatric, fields. But since from the 1970s onwards, it really became a religious phenomenon, specifically a high control Christian phenomenon. And so if we're thinking about where it's happening today, I mean, it can happen really, again, in a multiplicity of contexts. It can happen in hospitals, right? Transphobic healthcare practices. These are no doubt conversion practices. But if we're thinking about where do these happen most often, we're really going to be looking at churches, Christian ministries, camps, Christian, counseling offices. This is really where you're going to find a lot of what we're talking about as it relates to conversion therapy. The second part of your question was the term conversion therapy being a misnomer. And this absolutely is a misnomer. And every time I talk about conversion therapy or high control Christianity, which is where most of my research at this point is centering, I feel like I have to put everything in quotation marks, right? Like conversion therapy, good, bad, what's considered, evil and immoral, all of these things. Every time I write them, sin, I feel like I have to put everything in quotation marks. But of course, at a certain point, quotation marks lose their meaning when you use them for everything. So if we're talking specifically about conversion therapy, we're talking about something where there is no conversion, right? And there is no therapy. No one has ever converted from one gender to another, from one sexuality to another sexuality. And there's no therapy involved. What we're talking about is based on bunk science that not only is ineffective, but is actually harmful, right? It's a very these practices constitute very dangerous and death-dealing activities and efforts to change people for simply being themselves. And so I always say at this point, you shouldn't have to go to therapy after going to quote unquote therapy. And so conversion therapy is exactly not that. It is not therapy. And again, there is no conversion involved.
Conversion therapy is a lot more widespread than folks, including me, initially assumed. Can you give us some estimated numbers about how common these practices are in Canada or elsewhere?
Yeah, so research on the topic in Canada specifically is not as developed as it is, say, in the US. And so what we have right now, numbers wise, is that for sexual minority men, from the surveyed population, that folks 4% of folks identify as conversion therapy survivors. And so with that, that's compared to about 7% of all LGBTQ2S communities in the US. And again, we just simply don't have the numbers to identify exactly how many folks have undergone conversion therapy in Canada. Really, we're just talking about sexual minority men. But even with these numbers, and I always want to point this out when we talk about numbers, I think that there are a few issues. I think these are really good starting places for having a conversation about conversion therapy. But at the end of the day, the numbers, I think, will never be all that accurate, at least as accurate as we would like them to be. And the reason is that if we're talking about folks who have undergone conversion therapy, again, this is happening disproportionately within Christian communities, again, specifically conservative Christian communities. So you're talking about people who don't really trust people who are offering surveys, right? Inviting them to, hey, come take my survey. They're going to most likely say no. Why? Because they oftentimes don't trust higher education. Higher education in a lot of these conservative Christian traditions are seen as threats to the Christian faith, attacks on the Christian faith, which is why you oftentimes don't see a lot of the folks coming from these religious traditions going to these schools. Not to say that some of them don't, and in fact, some of them do. But again, oftentimes they're going to stick with either not going to, a university and or receiving a liberal arts education, and well, those are mostly in the U.S., but again, in Canada too. But on top of that too, they're highly skeptical of any sort of science. Or they would put it in quotes, science, but anything to do with, studies about gender, sexuality, anything to do with medical findings, right? We can think back to COVID and think about the number of folks who were resisting wearing masks. Why? Because they simply did not trust the science, because they said it was coming from liberal or progressive sources. So to have, accurate numbers would mean that we would have to have these folks involved in the surveys. So they're simply not going to participate. And or answer, accurately. Oftentimes, if they were to participate, what typically would happen is that they would say, "Well, I'm a straight person, I'm a heterosexual, and I'm simply struggling with same-sex attraction," which is typically the phrasing that these folks use. So they won't identify as someone who's gone through conversion therapy, and they also won't identify as a sexual minority or a gender minority. So that's the first part that sort of troubled the statistics that we have. The other problem is that a lot of folks don't know that they've gone through conversion therapy. Celeste in their introduction said that we had met at McMaster. And it was at McMaster that I realized that I went through conversion therapy. And it wasn't until I had a conversation with one of my office mates who, after I explained to her what exactly, I had gone through, she looked at me and she said, "Oh, so you've gone through conversion therapy." And I thought, well, gee whiz, maybe I have. And I just had never conceptualized it in those terms, because what happens is within a lot of these high control Christian spaces is that they don't refer to it as conversion therapy to those who they're subjecting to conversion therapy. They refer to it typically as, pastoral counseling, biblical worldview counseling. There are a bunch of other names that they use outside of, ecclesial or religious context, but those are the ones that are typically used within these Christian spaces. And so for me, I always understood my experience in conversion therapy up until that point as I was meeting with Pastor Dane to talk about, my same-sex attractions. However, after, talking to, my office mate and then to other folks at McMaster and beyond, that's when I started to realize, oh, shoot, this was conversion therapy, because I had heard about conversion therapy before that. I wasn't raised in the church. I chose to become an evangelical in high school. Not exactly my best decision, but, we all make decisions. And so I had, done that before. And so I always had, I had a life before the church, right? So I had one foot in, one foot out of the church, though for a long time, it was more so in the, the camp of the evangelical camp. But eventually, and again, as I went through grad school and started to think through a lot of my experiences at Liberty and at church and all this, this is when I started to realize, no, it actually definitionally aligns with conversion therapy. And so using that as, obviously anecdotal evidence, but this does align with a lot of the research on the topic, is that a lot of folks simply just don't identify as conversion therapy survivors because they've just never thought about it in those terms. So the 4% number that we have for Canadians, and the 7% or for sexual minority men in Canada, and the 7% for LGBTQ2S communities in general in the US, again, I think these are good starting places, right? These allow us to have a benchmark or sort of a place to begin to think about, okay, how many people really went through conversion therapy? However, there's again some qualitative obstacles or difficulties that we run into when we're trying to find accurate numbers, simply because folks don't trust the science or the researchers, and then on top of that, survivors don't understand themselves as survivors, at least not yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Drawing from other conversion therapy scholars and survivors, you argue that conversion therapy is motivated by genocidal intentions. Can you explain why this is the case and why people should understand it as motivated by genocidal intentions? And how does this understanding help us understand why no one could actually consent to conversion therapy?
Yeah. I think oftentimes when people hear the phrasing genocidal intentions, they're immediately off put. They're like, okay, chill out, right? Like, don't be so histrionic, like, don't be so melodramatic. But What I will say first and foremost is that this idea is not original to me. This is actually an idea that every time I talk about conversion therapy, I bring this up. And it's an idea that my friends Christine Robinson and Sue Spivey out of George Mason University in the US, in Virginia, they're the ones who first wrote the first article on this topic. And I should say that I come from genocide studies, right? Most of my research in the past was in Holocaust studies. And so thinking through this idea of, okay, can we understand conversion practices as motivated by genocidal intentions? I do think it stands to reason. And the reason is that, and to sort of put it plainly, is that if conversion practitioners could have their way, LGBTQ 2+ communities would not exist, right? That they have a dead set intent on completely destroying queer life, queer culture, queer identity, queer expression, queer vitality, queer everything, right? Queer memory, because they simply do not want us to exist. They don't want any of this to exist. This is a very inconvenient reality in their worldview, which presupposes that everyone is a heterosexual, heteronormative subject at their core, and that any sort of deviation from the heteronormative model is a perversion, is a sin, is a detriment really to society. So these folks, again, I'm not saying that they are genocidal, right, in the sense that they're out there killing people. Although, if you look in certain places in this world, you will find them. And on top of that, if you look at certain sermons preached specifically in the US, but again, I always find it funny when Canadians try to make us seem like we're immune to this, as if it's always worse in the US. No, like we have these problems too. But there are televised, what's the word? Sermons that are put online from certain preachers in the U.S. that are easily accessible, where they do call for the extermination of queers, right? Again, they're not doing it in a physical sense, but I do think that, and I think we all know that genocide's not always physical or bodily, right? That there's also such thing as genocide in cultural terms. We can think, of course, of Indigenous populations in Canada, right? Residential schools, the 60s Scoop, right? These different efforts to homogenize and whitewash and change Indigenous populations in Canada. What we're talking with conversion therapy, these are efforts to, again, change queers, whether they be gender or sexual minorities, to, again, become straight or to become heteronormative, or at least pretend or suppress or repress, their very selves, or constitutive parts of themselves, should I say. When I think about this idea of conversion practitioners or conversion practices being part of, or being motivated by genocidal intentions, I'm thinking about this as not just, again, something that happens just in Canada and the US, right? This is happening on a global scale. This is something that's exported. A lot of the teachings really do originate from the US and Australia. Canada has its own history as well, but really we're talking about US and then Australia. But these are efforts that, again, might have originated here, or ideas, should I say more accurately, that originate in these Western contexts. But they become global, and they have become a planned and very coordinated and well-funded long-term efforts to change gender and sexual minorities. So although, again, it's not that the average conversion practitioner is out there trying to kill queer folks, they certainly have the intentions for us to be not in existence any longer.
Thank you. So in the book, there are 17 stories authored by conversion therapy survivors, including yourself, and you all have varying backgrounds, experiences, and are from different places around the world. How did you all find each other and decide to write the book together?
Well, I was one day at the doctor's office, and I got a message on X, the artist formerly known as Twitter, and it was from this editor at this press, or what they said was a press, and they said, "Hey, we've been following your writing about conversion therapy. Do you think you'd be interested in putting a book together?" And I thought, scam! Like this, there's no way this is real, right? Like who gets a message on Twitter, right? And so I quickly looked up, the editor. I quickly looked up the press, and both were legitimate, surprisingly. And I responded. I said, "Yeah, let's have a quick Zoom." And so we did, and again, sort of verified that these folks, were real. And they said, again, most of my writing at this point really was in Holocaust studies, at least in my academic writing. But at this point, I had started to write more about my experience in conversion therapy, and also just about Liberty more generally, Liberty University, which is where my undergrad was. more generally. And because of that, again, I guess they had been tracking it. And so they, again, reached out and they said, hey, like, what do you want for this collection if you were to do this collection? I said, at the end of the day, I really just want survivors. I don't want fictional accounts of conversion therapy. Maybe there's a place for those. It's just not in my book or a book that I would want to put together. I want stories, testimonial accounts of what folks have undergone in conversion therapy. And so they agreed. And I signed the contract. And from there, because of the writing I had been doing about, conversion therapy, I had, made a number of, online contacts with different folks around the world who had undergone conversion therapy. And so I reached out to them. I said, hey, would you be interested in submitting? And if not, would you be interested in, amplifying this on your social media? And so put out the call and just essentially waited, a few months. Finally, I got a bunch of stories. Not all of them were included. There were a few that I wasn't able to include for a number of reasons. But at the end of the day, I found 16, survivors with stories that I thought were compelling and I thought should be included. And so I worked with those authors over the span of maybe 6, 8, 9, 10. I have no idea. Time's not a thing after COVID, right? A few months. And we chit-chatted and, again, workshopped pieces back and forth. And then I reached out to Garrett, who wrote the foreword. I had been on a panel with him once, and we had sort of stayed in contact since, and that's how the collection came together.
Thank you. And you mentioned, what was the word you used? Like the stories were captivating or something, and they absolutely are. And my next question is about one of them. So you're obviously very familiar with the abusive, violent, and anti-scientific tactics of conversion therapy. That said, what did you learn from your collaborators? Did any one particular story stand out to you or teach you something new? And for example, when I was reading the text, even though I was relatively familiar with conversion therapy because of all of your lessons and teachings, Gregory Elisar's Chavez's chapter, Sniffing the Gay Away, really shocked me when I read it for the first time. The author was advised by his therapist to, in essence, smell dog shit when he felt attracted to other men, which is a particularly unsettling and disgusting form of aversion therapy. So I'm wondering, like, what stories really stuck out to you or allowed you to rethink or learn something new?
Yeah. So I'll start with the research and then I'll jump into the story specifically, if that's okay. One thing when I was doing the research about conversion therapy, again, before we had set up the distinction between conversion therapy being a programmatic sort of effort or efforts to change an individual, whereas conversion practices can be, everyday sort of things that happen to people, or, efforts or attempts to change an individual to, again, align with the heteronormative model. And one thing when I was doing the research, and the research about the research behind expanding the scope to talk not just about conversion therapy but conversion practices, this is coming from some folks and survivors and academics and researchers and activists out of Australia, and that's where a lot of the really good work's really happening is out of Australia right now about conversion therapy. And so when I was chatting actually with some of the folks who had written this piece that, again, really informs a lot of the work that I do and informs, of course, the introduction that I wrote for the collection, I started to think about conversion practices as not just happening to, again, so like, let me backpedal a second. I started thinking that, okay, not every queer person has undergone conversion therapy, and thank God, right? Like not a badge of honor that you want to sort of wear. It's never something that I thought like, oh, I can't wait to tell everyone that I went through conversion therapy. It's not a cute look, right? However, I will say that every single queer person has experienced conversion practices, right? That every single queer person, when they were a kid and they were in the playground, if they were at home, if they were at church, if they were in synagogue, they were wherever, that they received messaging, again, that accumulates over time, that it's simply not okay to be you, right? That you as you, right? However you express yourself, whatever your identity is, that's not all right. And it's not a safe sort of space to express that. And that for me was sort of shocking, right? Because again, I'm not the kind of person who's like, let's expand the definition so everyone feels included. No, I think there's really, good reasons to have strong and clear-cut definitions and, terms. However, when we do think about this, we realize the sort of the pervasiveness of these practices, right? That I really do think that and again, this isn't necessarily anything new, but I always find myself to be sort of like this like late bloomer and slow realizer of everything, that our entire sort of society, right, is set up to change us and to align us with the heteronormative model. And I think that for me was just sort of this light bulb moment. And then I thought even further about it, and I thought, well, wait a second. It's not just, sexual minorities, but also gender bendy folks too, in the sense of, if there's, I have friends growing up who were straight, and they wore nail polish and they were, ridiculed for doing that. And that again is also a conversion practice, and that's for straight folks, right? So it's not just queer sexual minority folks, but we're also talking about straight folks can undergo conversion practices as well. And so again, I'm not trying to make everyone feel included and, like live comfortably under the same roof. That's not the goal, but it is something that allowed me to realize that what we're talking about when we're talking about conversion therapy, there are so many sort of reverberations and sort of parallels to other, again, phenomena, experiences, conditions, contexts that really do try to change us and again homogenize us in a way that they feel comfortable, right? Really, I think at the end of the day, it's to make other folks feel comfortable, because then everything's the same, everything's safe and comfortable and easy, or even and easy. But I do think that again, that was sort of this again light bulb moment for me, and maybe that's not necessarily all that profound for other folks, but I will say and be honest that was for me. As for stories, I mean, yeah, you referenced Greg's story, and it's shocking, right? Like it's the first story in the collection, and you read it and you're like, dear Lord, like what in the world is this? But this is a form of aversion therapy, perhaps more well-known forms of aversion therapy include electroshock therapy, which happened actually at a lot of universities, much later than a lot of people would expect. But Harvard, Brigham Young, a number of universities actually had a lot of electroshock therapy programs to try to change folks' genders and/or sexualities. But if we're thinking about a story that resonated with me, I would say that I don't know if any story surprised me other than perhaps where, you realize like that someone can be their own conversion therapist, and that's, a lot more common than we think. So, but perhaps that, but I think that the story for me that stands out, was a story that it's written by one of the Australian contributors. And he was writing about his experience. He was in this band and they were traveling around, and he's writing about his time in the band, but he's sort of having these flashbacks to his time in conversion therapy. And in those flashbacks, he talks about how there was anxiety surrounding showering for him. And this was something that I don't know, I guess I just sort of buried it, or I just didn't really think about it for a long time. But I did not think about, or for a long time, and this was even before conversion therapy. This was when I was just in the church. I was in high school, actually. There was such anxiety for me to shower, because the anxiety was that if I was in the shower too long, that I would be aroused and then masturbate. That was the big sort of like, boogeyman. And I was consistently, what's the word? Anxious to go and have a shower. And I, showered every day. But again, it was this thing where something as commonplace, something as mundane as showering becomes this site of anxiety within these high control religious contexts, right? That something that really is normal and no one should give two hoots about or even think twice about. This is something that becomes, for those who are within this system, really nerve-wracking, really, like, what's the word? Again, anxiety really is the word. And I just thought back to that, where I had so many things in my life where I felt like the world was on my shoulders. If I made this decision, well, gosh, then this would, result in this, or this would result in this. And if I don't share the gospel with this person, well, then maybe they're going to go to hell. And if I go into the shower and I masturbate, well, then that's another, brick laid on that, potential road to hell. If in fact I don't stay on the straight and narrow, pun completely intended, right? I think that this story brought this up for me, that I had, again, sort of blocked out how my everyday life, it felt like everything mattered so much and was hypercharged or over invested with meaning, that looking back, it was just this emotionally taxing, laborious way of being. And these are some of the consequences of being both within high control religion, but also in conversion therapy more specifically, that you, again, things that really shouldn't matter become really, points of fixation that really take a toll on your mental health, and really take a long time to undo. And so that for me was a story that really stuck out to me. But I would say that, all of the stories, there are stories like Greg's that are super shocking, but all of the stories in there really are giving you a different perspective on conversion therapy and showing you in how these practices manifest in different ways across religious traditions, even in, non-religious contexts, and give voice to really, again, the consequences of conversion therapy.
Thank you. Nathan Shah's authors chapter 6, Away and Away, and writes of, quote, the profound joy of appeasing my parents by pretending to be straight, overwhelming any other of my unfulfilled desires, and how natural it felt to continue resisting my body, my mind, myself, because I had done so all my life, unquote. Xiao's experience of resisting their body, desires, and themselves, and how doing so felt so natural and even good because of the pressures and shame seemed to echo throughout the book. This idea seemed to pervade many of the stories. Can you tell us more about how the violent tactics used by conversion therapists get construed as feeling, quote, natural and even good, even as they go against everything a person wants and brings no real joy?
Yeah. So again, to zoom out, and then I'll zoom back in, but to zoom out and to talk about high control religion, mostly Christian, but again, this really is applicable to really a lot of different religious traditions. That within religious systems, and I should say Nathan's story that you're referencing, Away and Away, which is, I think, one of the most beautifully written stories in the collection. It's just breathtaking, and I think there actually is this sort of like, you feel suffocated reading that story because there's this repetition that just, it's so monotonous. What's the word? It wears on you, and then by the end of it, you're sort of caught without breath. It feels like suffocating, I guess. But putting that aside, if we're talking about high control religion, so Nathan's story is from what he describes as a Chinese cult. But if we're talking about Christian, high control Christianity, specifically Oregon, high control religion in general, what we find is that oftentimes what is good and what is evil or what is bad, and what is moral, what is immoral, it's sort of the inverse or the opposite. It's sort of where everything's sort of turned on its head. And it's wild to see, in real time today. If, again, not to say this isn't happening in Canadian politics, because it absolutely is, but I think it's perhaps more clearly seen in US politics. What is considered good is what most folks would say is really bad, and what is considered bad is really, good. And so I think that within these contexts, where sexuality is seen as scary, sexuality is seen as taboo, sexuality is seen as bad, unless it is within very particular confines, right? If you transgress this boundary, or if you do this, outside of marriage, then it's bad. But if you're doing it within monogamous cis-het marriage, then it's fine. Which I always find it so funny, right? This idea, it feels very like hocus pocus, where it's like, if you have sex, 30 minutes before your marriage, not okay. But if you do it 30 minutes after, everything's fine. It's like, why is that? It's like, well, they got married. But what does that mean? I don't know. They got married. Okay, cool. Excellent logic. Putting that aside, I think that what we find within these contexts is that again, the whole sort of moral universe is confused and confusing. And so when you're trapped in there, again, there is a logic. I mean, it's not consistent, but there is a logic to these, religious contexts, that when you're in there, you become so convinced that what, your religious leader or religious leaders are saying is true. And it's sort of, you're within this sacred canopy, you're within this world that feels separate and distinct from, isolated from the rest of the world. And so when you're in this sort of isolationist environment, even if you are, again, I grew up in Toronto, one of the most multicultural cities in the world, one of the least Christian cities in the world too. Yet I still found my sacred canopy. I found my bubble. And I stayed within that, some might say religiously. And within that sort of context, I was able to, again, convince myself and help others convince themselves. And it's this mutually reinforcing sort of space where everyone is like, we're right, right, guys, yeah, we're right, we're good, yeah. And I mean, even if you look at like liturgy from Christian, worship music, there's this constant repetition, this need to repeat, to remind yourself of what you believe, and you have to believe it. And if you don't, well, you're outside of this system. So for those of us who were within the system, especially with the threat of hell sort of, and always sort of there, like if you don't do this, watch out, you might be in hell, which is a really good way of convincing people to believe something, that they're going to burn eternally for not following exactly what you do. When you have all of this sort of working in concert, it creates a system where you're willing to sacrifice what you think is right and good, even at your own expense. And for me, growing up, where I did grow up I didn't grow up in a Christian home, but I grew up in a home where I knew it wouldn't be okay to be gay because my mom, was a sweet, sweet homophobe. But with that, laying the foundation and then joining this religious community, and then again, reinforcing that religious community by going to Liberty University, the world's largest evangelical university, and talk about an isolationist environment where you're, for all intents and purposes, on that campus, most of your 4 years that you're there. It creates this world where you don't think there is an alternative because, again, you've been so convinced in this space that all of what your leaders are saying is true. And so for me, even though I knew that I was gay, I wouldn't have identified as gay. But again, there's that sort of bodily or corporeal knowledge, your body knows. And your mind knows too, but it's those constant mental gymnastics that you have to perform and continue to perform in order to, again, remain within the system. That allowed me to really believe that, again, I needed to reject this part of myself because this is the part of myself that if I feed it, if I, live into it, well, then that's going to take me one place and one place only, and that's hell. And so I think that the moral system that's, again, you're always sort of dangling over the burning fires of hell, that allow you to really be convinced that this is true. And so for me, that was really, again, this context and this motivating factor really was why I believed this. But again, I think when you have a religious community, so many folks who are constantly saying, over and over that this is good, this reinforces it, this naturalizes it, this normalizes this message to the point that you think, well, if I question it, then again, I must be one of them on the other side of this bubble. I must be a heretic. I must be, someone who working for the enemy. And this is, even though I bring it up now and I bring up the language of working for the enemy, it's funny because I think today, that sounds so unnatural. It sounds, again, so weird because I'm not in that system. But at the time, that's exactly how we talked, right? We talked about the enemy. We talked about Satan himself. And it was always him, who was coming after us. And it was always sort of hubristic to think that Satan himself was coming for me, right? Out of everyone in the world, he's coming for me, but that's how it sort of was framed. So I think this is really how it's done. And then in conversion therapy context specifically, again, they're largely Christian context or religiously motivated sort of practices. So I think that all of this sort of maps onto those spaces, those conversion therapy spaces, and then therefore, again, it's just sort of this continuation of the system. So I think that's really why you find this idea of goodness being considered bad and bad being considered good, and what is natural being considered unnatural. Because again, the whole moral system is sort of confused and upside down, and that's the space that you live in. So you think that it's just the way things are.
That's so fascinating. As you're talking about good and bad and things being turned upside down, I just keep thinking about the decision that the federal government made yesterday about yes, let's get pipelines and let's make an agreement with the government of Alberta that has quite recently, made the population even more transphobic. And I'm just what is good and what is nothing makes sense right now. And as you're describing it, I'm it is this, it is exactly this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I feel very demoralized, just making me think about what is going on.
Yeah.
Pipelines, I don't understand. Anyway.
But you know what, Casey, this is something that I think about. It's, again, I think about Margaret Atwood's Surfacing, her book Surfacing. And in the beginning of the book, she's talking about how there's this cancer creeping up from the south. And of course, you're sitting there reading this from, I was in Hamilton, Ontario, and I'm thinking, they're talking about America, US, and, the sort of Americanism sort of infecting Canada. The irony of the book, and I think one of Atwood's main points, is that at the end of the book, the most American or US character in the story is a Canadian. Right. So it's we always think, oh, the US, they're the problem. They've got, all of this sort of a shitstorm of, politics. And we're better up here. And there's sort of this sense of moral superiority. But if we look at Alberta, right, as case in point, the Texas of Canada, right? The notwithstanding clause, looking at, again, like transphobic policies and, looking at, before the pipeline, right? Looking at really like anything that Danielle Smith touches is in line with all of this tomfoolery. And so what I think, though, is that we oftentimes think that, you're saying, like, how is this happening? What's going on? And again, we always think that the US, they're the ones with the white Christian nationalist problem. And they are folks with a white Christian nationalist problem. But again, Canada is not immune. And I think that for a lot of folks in Canada, when we look around, we see the politics around us, we see what's going on, and we don't realize that there is such a sort of like this like silent minority, and they are a minority, but they're a very powerful minority, and they're very what's the word, effective, politically effective and affective, but putting that aside, in how they spread their ideology. And again, how is this happening? Again, I'm not saying it's all white Christian nationalists, but it certainly is one of the really sort of like major problems that we're facing today that are affecting Alberta. And surprise, surprise, there are so many evangelical and white Christian fundamentalists living where? Alberta. And so I think that, again, there's such a problem with politics as it relates to religion, because the line between the two are blurred and they don't really see the difference. They think everything is under God's kingdom or, advancing God's kingdom. Therefore, everything's fair game to touch. And so I think that, again, I'm not saying that that's the answer to the question, what's happening, but I do think it's a motive or an influential factor as to why we're seeing what we're seeing today in Canadian politics.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because isn't Canada, like, we're home of the Proud Boys, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just thinking about them. I have another question for you, but thank you for that, Luke. I think when I was reading the text, well, I know you, so I wasn't actually all that surprised when there are really funny bits in there. And I think maybe that would shock people, because when we're thinking and talking about conversion therapy, obviously things are traumatic and heart-wrenching, and a lot of the stories are those things. But you use humor often when you're telling your stories, including in the book and in various other avenues. And I think some readers might be kind of surprised by those comedic elements. I'm wondering if you can tell us about the conversations you had with the authors about the role of humor, perhaps queer humor in particular, in sharing these stories, and how humor has played a role when you share your experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we can either cry or we can laugh, right? And these are two responses, right? These are two responses to, two different ways of approaching a topic. And they oftentimes work in tandem, like the story that I wrote and also other stories in the collection, right? It's not just that there's comedy or there's just sort of like, sad moments, that they oftentimes work, together. But I think that, it's funny, people's, what's the word? Expectations for folks who have undergone, experiences like conversion therapy, that there's oftentimes an expectation that there's some sort of like a proper way of dealing with it, or a proper way of talking about it, or a proper way of representing these experiences. And for me, humor is one way of addressing what happened. And for me, when I'm thinking about humor, or the way that I use humor, is really to magnify not what happened to me or the consequences of conversion therapy, but to point out the absurdity of it, right? For me, I mean, I was told when I was in conversion therapy that I needed to do manly things, masculine things, and talk to men and be around men and share a lot of time with men. And I'm like, okay, like, are we on the homosocial, on the homoerotic? Okay, sort of, what's the word? Whatever. So I was told these things, right? That I needed to be around men and to do the things that men do. And then they even suggested things like carpentry. And I was like, okay, like Jesus, like, like want me to do woodwork? Wait a second. What are you asking me to do? Woodwork? And so there was all these like sort of like ridiculous and absurd elements to my experience. And even at the time that I was in it, I remember sitting there being like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, no way no chance in hell am I going to do that. Or would I, again, like watch the basketball game? Like, I don't even like know, like, like who's my, anyway, I know the Raptors, but that's about it. Past that, I can't really name you any basketball teams. But it was like, they would ask me to do all these things. And I remember, and even in the story, there's this, the pastor, my conversion therapist, Dane Emmerich, he says, he's like, we're going to go out and go on a hike and get sweaty together and be men together. And I was like, he's like, who's coming with me? And I was like, not a chance in hell. Like, no way, Jose. Like, as if, like, I'm not going to be around these guys. And it was all these guys that, for me, like, in part why I went to the conversion therapy group. I had been going to the one-on-one group, or the one-on-one program the entire time that I was at Liberty, from freshman year to senior year, so first to fourth year. But then I decided later on, I was like, I want to go to that group on campus to see, who the other homos are, right? Or the other guys struggling with same-sex attraction. And for me, I always had sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the camp. But, I was also a gay, college student, university student. So I wanted to know who else was gay, or again, struggling with same-sex attraction. So I went with this guy who had a big crush on it. I talk all about this in the story. And we went, and again, I was immediately disappointed. Like, I saw the guys and I was like, gosh darn it, like, these are the guys I thought would be here. Except for one guy who I wasn't sure. And I realized the term now was cruising, but I would cruise him in the cafeteria. Like, I would see him in the cafeteria and I'd like make like very long sustained eye contact with him. And I was always like, I wonder if he's gay. Sure enough, seeing him at the group conversion therapy cleared things up. I all of a sudden had my answer. And that was that. But for me, like, there's so much of this that's just ridiculous, right? Like, what does a university do with the gay students on campus who they want to keep apart because they know that if they're together, they might hook up? Oh, they put them in a hot, sweaty room once a week and try to change them together. What in the world is that tomfoolery, right? Like, give me a break. And so looking back, I can't help but find the comical aspects, thinking to myself, gosh, like, what a stupid idea. It's like Exodus International conferences. They all go to a hotel and have a conference there. What do you think's happening at that hotel, in the evenings? Like, my word. So this is sort of, for me, I think that conversion therapists and high control Christians and high control religionists in general really just give us the material to look at and to laugh at. And sort of like be like, really, like, you're just putting this out there and this is really what you think and this is what you propose. And I think for me, for me, I can laugh at it, and I do laugh at it because, again, I find it just absurd. And I think the comedy really highlights the absurdity of these practices and the folks who practice these things. I think it would be a lot funnier if it weren't for the fact that all these practices have real world consequences, right? And so it's sort of holding those two things in tension, having, some reverence, some piety, I guess, for those who are affected, myself included, while also being able to say, this is an unbelievably silly system that needs to be ridiculed. And I think if we can take anything from the Harris-Trump election, was that I think that there's a disruptive ethic in pointing out and laughing at the absurdity, when it is absurd, of another position. And I think there's a political efficacy there. I really do. I know that not everyone's going to agree with that, and that's fine. But I do think that we saw holes in the facade of the Trump sort of, campaign. And we really sort of like tore those open and was like, look at, like, the wizard behind, this campaign. And it was just, again, Trump sort of a clown. And that's what I think that a lot of people were picking up on. And I'm so glad for that. And I try to do that in my own writing, where I look at those who are in power, those who are abusing their power and abusing others, and showing them for who they are, and laughing while doing it.
Yeah, thank you. I do think that there's something disruptive about laughing, like, in a really, and it's a joyful feeling. I don't know. I think it's like an important, queer praxis, maybe. It's laughter.
Can I pick up on that, Casey, really quickly?
Always.
Is that okay? So
Yes.
I think back to most of what I wrote in the past was on Holocaust literature. One of the best known Holocaust authors who wrote about their experience in the Holocaust was Elie Wiesel, and he has this story about the sacrifice of Isaac, where Isaac was supposed to be sacrificed by his father, and then by the end of it, essentially, both Isaac Isaac laughs at God, And I thought about this idea of laughing at God. And again, when I was reading this story, I was an evangelical. So I was like, oh my gosh, you can't laugh at God. Like how terrible, like who do you think you are? But I do think there's nothing more disruptive, nothing more uncomfortable than being laughed at. And there's an unbelievable power at being able to laugh at someone or something. And again, not that we should be out there like poking fun and making fun of everyone. That's not my point. But I do think that I don't think there's anything that cuts to the core more than someone laughing at you. And that's more than words, that's more than physicality, but someone to laugh at you. I think there's something about that is so unsettling and so, again, disruptive that I think that's why comedy is, one of the most sort of like today our comedians are truth tellers, and our politicians, or like the kings, or the rulers are the ones who are. Anyway, I'm getting lost in my metaphor, but what I mean to say is that laughter really it does have this political efficacy that I think is more profound than I think a lot of folks at first blush sort of realize.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so conversion therapy is now illegal in Canada, but you insist that Canadians need to remain vigilant because conversion therapy is still going on. How is it going on, and what new tactics or discourses are conversion practitioners using? And has anyone been charged yet under this law for practicing conversion therapy?
So conversion practitioners in the height of the ex-gay movement was the 80s and into the 90s. What happened was at the end of the 90s and into the 2000s was that a lot of the leaders were exposed for the shams that they were. So, John Polk who was the chairperson of Exodus International. He was found at a gay bar in DC. A bunch of folks were found in meth-fueled orgies in motels across the country, across the US. Again, sort of discrediting their positions and their claims that you could change your sexuality. And so with the fall of a number of these different leaders, and there's a Netflix documentary about a lot of these folks, with the fall of these folks, again, the ex-gay movement had to sort of reorient and re-strategize because they were such public figures at this point that people knew them, right? It wasn't just within Christian context that people, recognized John Polk or Ann Polk or, whomever, Randy Scobie, all these folks, that people outside of, Christian circles knew them. Why? Because they were advertising on billboards, in magazines. They were on covers of magazines, right? They were doing this major PR sort of move to export conversion practices outside of ecclesial or Christian context and into the wider public. And so once these folks had their sort of like falls from grace, they decided to retreat and turn inward. And so there was no longer an extensive PR campaign. There was no longer advertising. There was no longer really public discussions of this. And in fact, any discussion that there was, they tried to sort of hush it and make sure that it, no one heard about, again, that this just doesn't work. On top of that, folks started researching conversion practices more so. And then there was this tide of research that really sort of just, again, overwhelmingly communicated that not only is it ineffective, but it's damaging. And then on top of that, there was also just the growing societal sort of, pendulum, or the swinging of the societal pendulum, where people were starting to, in many ways, affirm at least same-sex marriage, right? In Canada, 2005, it was legalized. In the US, 2015. Again, not that codification, of social mores into law necessarily reflects the entire society, by no means, but it does certainly help. And of course, what we found in the past few years is there's sort of this regression, or what feels like to be, a regression. Whatever. So all of this to say is that the climate for conversion practices that, again, really a lot of people were trying to hide what they were doing in the past, or had been trying to hide what they've been doing in the past few years. Really, the only real main exception at this point is the Changed movement. You can check them on Instagram. They're wild. They're absolutely wild. And these are the only ones. They're out of Bethel Ministries, which is out of Redding, California. They're just a really sort of like cuckoo group of people, but they are the ones who are the public face of conversion therapy today. But with all of this being said, progressively, again, most Christian, churches and also organizations and ministries, whatever, again, they started doing this work behind closed doors. It was happening behind closed doors before, but really they really tried to make sure that no one knew about it. Not just that it was happening, but that no one was going to know about it. And so what they started doing was, again, not advertising outside the communities, but advertising only within. And that really created a culture of silence and of secrecy and of shame, but silence and secrecy, right? And so when the law was passed a few years ago in Canada that banned conversion practices for any age nationwide, these organizations, they didn't stop doing what they were doing, right? If you think about crime in any context, if it's, if drugs are illegal, which I don't think they should be, but if drugs are illegal, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be, people who are either dealing drugs or doing drugs, right? It's just going to go underground. It's just going to be secret. It's just going to be silenced, or they'll be silent about it, should I say? And so, in the same way, crime, conversion therapy in Canada, is going to continue to happen. It's just going to happen behind closed doors, and they're going to use a lot more euphemistic language, right? They're not going to say that they're doing conversion therapy. That term really wasn't used other than by academics and activists from like 2000 onwards. They're going to say again that they're doing pastoral counseling, biblical worldview counseling, this kind of stuff. And if you ever see on any church's website, any sort of ministry that's helping people with addiction or wholeness, like the idea of being a whole and holy person, that as it relates to gender and sexuality, if the words gender and sexuality show up on their on that website in this conversation of addiction or wholeness and holiness, they're talking about 9 times out of 10 conversion therapy. And so for me, I remember I did a quick Google search from my place in Toronto in Cabbagetown. There was a church like 3 blocks away, this Catholic church that was practicing conversion therapy after the ban. I haven't checked since, and I actually don't even remember what the church is. But this goes to show you that just because there's a law in Canada doesn't mean it's not going to happen. As for has anyone challenged, the law, or has anyone been charged under the law? No. In Canada, no one has. And in some ways I understand why. In other ways, it's baffling. I think that people haven't done it yet because there has been no legal precedent set for pursuing conversion, infractions of this law to date, right? And so you don't want to set a bad legal precedent and then from that point forward, sort of, mess up the decisions. The other thing, though, is that we know that conversion therapy is happening. We know organizations where this is happening. I have a friend, Pam Rocker. She runs a nonprofit out in Calgary. And she heard and then verified that there was a speaker being invited from the US to come to this Christian conference. The guy comes up and he starts speaking, and he was promoting conversion practices. And in Canada, that's protected under the law. You cannot promote conversion practices, let alone, practice it, right? And so she called her bylaw officer and she said, hey, this church over here has a conference going on and they're promoting conversion practices. And the guy said, but they're not talking about it they're not using the words conversion therapy. And she said, of course they're not using the words conversion therapy. Why would they use the words conversion therapy? And they said, because if that's what they're doing, wouldn't that be what they're calling it? And she said, sir, do you think that drug dealers are like going around and saying like, hey, do you want some cocaine on the side of the road? Like, no, they're going to use euphemistic language, my friend, right? And the bylaw officer refused to in any way investigate or to go to this church because he said, well, at the end of the day, they're not calling it conversion therapy. And so this is the system that we're working with, my friends. You know what I mean? Like, not the most competent folks. But on top of that, again, I think that we know that it's happening. It's just that folks are sort of, I think, nervous about how to go about it. There are conversations that I'm a part of right now in certain like think tanks and whatnot where we're talking about this. But it is something that needs to be addressed and needs to be challenged because these people need to be held to account for the dirty work that they're doing.
Thank you, Luke. I do have another question that I just thought of, but I will hold off because we are going to open up the floor for any questions from folks online or in person. Do your online hand raise or whatever it is.
Exactly. So if anyone has any questions online, you can type them into the chat. We can read them out. You could also raise your virtual hand and you could open your mic and ask the question also. That's an option. And those of you here in the space, just raise your hand. We'll run a microphone over. There's a question right here. Okay, great.
Hi, thank you. My name is Megan. I haven't read your book yet. Sounds great. I'd love to read it. And so maybe you talk about this in your book. But I mean, I did not experience conversion therapy, but there was a brief moment in middle school where I could have. And I remember like being in this church, they really did a lot of like youth recruitment. You know, they had live music and like a candy station, you know, really got me hooked. And I remember that they sat us down to do sex education. I don't think they called it that. Anyways, and that they had like an entire curriculum. They have like videos made for that church. They have like, you know, a whole program that lasted the whole summer, and I didn't continue going. But it just makes me think, like, in the research about conversion therapy, especially with this culture of like silence and like being underground, not using the language of conversion therapy, like how do you get your hands on that like program, those programs, those curriculums that they're using? Like, are people doing content analyses of the actual curriculums that they're using, and like what are they saying in there behind closed doors?
Yeah. So, I mean, the truth of the matter is that nothing that these folks are saying is anything new since the 80s. So in the 70s, what we found was that folks were trying to change through the transformative power of Jesus and, you know, Christ's sacrifice on the cross. It was very much rooted in spiritual terms. There was no marriage of you know, sort of bunk psychology and theology. It was strictly in the theological realm. However, once we got to the 80s, we found that a number of Christian researchers, and I use that term very loosely, you know, these were folks who were writing books, writing curriculum about conversion or trying to change people's genders or sexualities. And what happened was that a lot of the Christian ministries, these like theologically rooted Christian ministries, jumped on to these Christian researchers because they were like, oh shoot, they're giving us legitimacy. They're showing us in psychological terms what we've been saying for years, not that many years. It really only started in 1973. But we've been saying this for a few years, and they're giving us sort of credibility, right? They're allowing us to sort of, legitimize the ministries that we've been providing. Of course, these researchers jumped on these ministries because they gave them money. Right? It was very much this symbiotic relationship, and they were being paid to do it. Right? They were buying their books, they were buying their curriculum, they're buying, you know, having them come speak at their churches and their conferences. And so a lot of the work that these folks were doing in the 1980s, and these two groups that sort of merged and started working together, this formed the foundation for a lot of conversion ideology. Right? And ways to change an individual's sexual orientation, or tactics to change an individual's orientation and or gender expression and identity. So that content from the 80s up until today, there's really not much that's new. It's not like they're reinventing the wheel and coming up with anything new. Again, they're not basing any of what they're saying in science. They had one study, it was from a Columbia professor, Spitzer was his last name, I forget his first name, in the early 2000s, or the mid 2000s, should I say, who came up with this research, or he came up with this study that was published that claimed that conversion therapy worked, which was the first study out of like, I don't, in the extensive research I've done, could not find one other study where they claimed anything other than, you know, studies coming from conversion therapists. So he was the only legitimate, we'll talk about that in a second, sort of academic who was proposing that conversion therapy worked. Well, the folks sort of, I guess, activists, anti-conversion therapy activists looked into this study, and they started to do some digging. What they found was that this article that was published was not peer reviewed. It actually bypassed peer review because the person who had published it was well known up until that point, because he was actually very active in helping or in what's the word, depathologizing homosexuality from the DSM. So they were like, oh, he's legitimate. But of course, all of a sudden, you had this sort of like change of heart, come to Jesus moment where he's like proposing that conversion therapy works. And everyone's like, what the hell is going on? And so then they kept digging and digging and digging. Anyway, long story short, by the end of it, that article was not only retracted by the journal, but also by Spitzer himself, who then issued an apology saying, this wasn't true, it was inaccurate, and I apologize for the damage that this has done. So in other words, there is no research coming out from any credible, legitimate source since, well, ever, on conversion therapy. So all of what we found in the 80s really is the same. Now, if we're talking about trying to find curriculum today, we can still find it. And it's, there are undercover investigative sort of journalism or journalists who are looking into this, right? I know a few people who have like recorded their times in conversion therapy with different people. So you can get that content, and I can try to see if I can remember who those folks are and connect you with them. But on top of that, there are people who are writing about their experiences. So we can see that, and they bring out their curriculum. Garrett Conley, again, the author of Boy Erased, all of his curriculum that he received, that's actually in the National Museum of American History, the Smithsonian in DC. So you can find all of it there. So there are, and they collect a lot of different conversion therapy manuals. I have my manual. I still, it's Alan Mettinger's Growth into Manhood, Resuming the Journey, for anyone who's interested, former president of Exodus International, right? So there is the curriculum out there, but again, what you find across the curriculum or curricula is that there's nothing new. Now, again, if you really wanted to find up-to-date sources, you could, a lot of US organizations, they still have their stuff publicly available, and you can find that because, again, it's not outlawed. In Canada, that's going to be a much more difficult thing to find. And so that would be where my advice ends, because I don't actually know how I would find those folks, because again, even to offer what they're offering, which they still are offering, but I would have to be most likely plugged into a religious community and then be sort of pointed in that direction behind closed doors, sort of in a hush-hush way. So I don't actually know in the Canadian context how we would find that, but in the US context, it is, you can find it online. You can also find it through different repositories like the Museum, Smithsonian in DC and beyond.
Do we have any other questions from online or here in the space? Oh, Casey has a question.
I have a question. Have you seen the film But I'm a Cheerleader? And does it in any way align with your experience? Especially of like when I picture the practitioners of conversion therapy, I'm picturing RuPaul. So like, can you tell me
Was Dane Emmerich like RuPaul?
in what ways?
Dane Emmerich, so first of all, love the film. So good. This is an example of, I think, taking seriously conversion therapy by way of comedy, right? And I think this is, and again, I don't think that RuPaul Charles or Natasha Leone, I don't think that they've gone through conversion therapy, or the other folks who are in the film. But again, even if it wasn't, created by a conversion therapy survivor, I think they did such a good job, because so much of it really does align with what we were taught. Of course, it's dramatized. Of course, it's sort of embellished, right, for a comedic effect. But the thing about conversion therapy, the thing about high control Christians in general, is that you really don't have to do too much embellishment. You're okay to sort of stick to like the content that they offer, because it's already absurd. You're just like, oh my gosh, like, again, this is real. Okay, here we go. But if I'm thinking about like my conversion therapist, Dane Emmerich, it's so funny looking back at this man. So first of all, he was like highly involved in theater, which like the push to act, right? Like to act like a real man, and then you'll become a real man. It's like obviously, second nature for Dane Emmerich, who was like lived in the theater and like was constantly on stage or directing plays or whatever. The man knew how to follow a script, if you know what I'm saying. And so there was that. He also loved to bake. He also loved to, cook. And here's the thing. All of us know that baking and cooking and acting, none of these things are inherently feminine. But for a man who consistently pushed students to watch sports, to play sports, to do carpentry, to do manly things, it was highly ironic that his favorite activities were those which are typically associated with queer men, right? Like so it's, I think right away there's that. The other part is that, and I will never, how do I say this? I have multiple people who have reached out to me and shown me that Dane Emmerich has like made like advancements, or like has hit on them in his DMs and their DMs, right? And so it's like this man who can't follow, again, his own directives. It's so wild to see, because it's like, again, the hypocrisy, I think, within, again, conversion therapy, and the hypocrisy within, high control Christianity is just so glaringly obvious, and it's just so emphasized. And Anyway, I'm getting on a rabbit trail. You asked about the film. I think the film stands to reason. I think the film is absolutely hilarious, and I 100% endorse.
Same.
We do have a question from Zoom, and I can read that out. This is a question from Michaela, and Michaela asks, my question is, through your research, Lucas, as you put together your book or within your career, did or have you noticed any patterns in conversion practices within nations? Did you notice that some countries are notably more invasive or violent than others? And if so, what do you think we should take away from this?
I think there are some countries where it is it's illegal to be queer. There are some countries where there was proposed legislation to execute queer folks. That I'm thinking of Uganda specifically. That legislation was shut down or shot down. But I think if we're talking about like those specific countries where it's illegal or and you face certain penalties, whether it be jail or execution, because there are some countries where that is the case. I think those are like, again, those are outliers, right? Like those are not the majority of countries. As for what, any countries that are notably invasive or violent, I'm familiar really like the countries I'm familiar with as it relates to conversion therapy are US, Canada, Australia, and Brazil. All countries with really significant Christian populations, or at least politically powerful Christian populations. Maybe less so in Canada, obviously, but the other countries, I think that certainly stands true. And I don't think that in any of those countries, obviously, 3 of the 4 are Western countries, Brazil being from the global South. I can't think of any qualitative differences between them. I think what we find is that a lot of the US exports so much of this. Like they're some of the main producers of this of these teachings. They're the ones who write most of the books, are US based authors. And even with like high control Christianity, like what we see in Canada is it's a ripoff of what we see from both the US and like Hillsong specifically in Sydney, Australia. It's such again, like the style, and then what we see in Brazil. I was one time I was in Brazil and I was passing by this church, this like non-denominational church, which of course is its own denomination. And as I was passing by, it was like I was transported back to Toronto where I was at the Hillsong church there. And I was like, what the heck? And so it's, I think that what we see is that there's just a lot more similarities and overlap. I think that Christians these days are like unbelievably uncreative in a lot of ways, right? If we think about like Christian art being sort of like the sort of apex of like art for a very long time and how they were sort of at the forefront. Nowadays, I don't think we can say that. They're not necessarily thought leaders. They're not necessarily, creative leaders. And so that does apply, I think, in the context of conversion therapy as well. Yeah, that's maybe not a satisfying answer because I just said like, I don't think so, but that's the honest answer that I can give.
I have a question. So evidently lots of queer folks have a tense relationship with religious institutions. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, because like obviously queerness and religiosity aren't like inherently antithetical. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how maybe you've seen in your life or your work queer folks navigating religious institutions, maybe post-conversion therapy, and also how do you envision queer folks collaborating with religious institutions? Like how do you feel about that?
Mm-hmm. I think that queer Christians just go to the Episcopal Church or the United Church of Canada. They leave the Evangelical Church and that's where they go, right? Like they go to the High Church or again to the United Church oftentimes. Kind of tongue-in-cheek answer, but kind of true. I find that a lot of folks who come from like high control Christian context, they either give up on faith and spirituality altogether, or they trade it in for another. And I think that for me, I just gave up on it. Like I have like zero desire for anything spiritually related. Like I don't want to, there's nothing about like any sort of new age or like spiritual sort of like practice, like none of it interests me anymore. It all sort of gives me like, I just, it's not for me. However, to your point, Christianity and religion in general is not antithetical to queerness. But a lot of queers do leave. But for those who are still invested or still have some sort of connection to the divine or the supernatural or whatever, or a higher power, or what they might still refer to as God, I think that there's a lot of space for them in a lot of different religious traditions. I named the United Church of Canada, the Episcopal Church in the US, Anglican Church in Canada too. But there are a number of affirming denominations. There are, we can think of, Reform Judaism, very much a welcoming sort of religious tradition. There are other religious traditions, that have queer congregations or, queer affirming congregations. And I think to myself that, well, I'll give you an example. I mean, I'm working on my next book. It's about queer experiences at Christian colleges, universities, seminaries, and divinity schools. And in that collection, I sent out a questionnaire to my contributors and I asked them, I said, answer what you feel comfortable with. Don't answer what you don't feel comfortable with. They answered actually, no one said they didn't feel comfortable, which was great. And one of the questions was, what's your faith commitment today? And I had a surprising number of folks say, oh, I'm at this church now. And I'm thinking to myself, like, there's one guy, he's, a professor in New York City. And I thought he was often sort of like, progressive, way to the left. And he's still going to church these days. And I'm like, all right, rock on. Like, you do you. Like, I think that there are a number of affirming congregations. There's a number of affirming authors and queer authors who write about this topic, right? Brandon Robertson's God and the Queer Christian. Before that, Matthew Vine's God and the Gay Christian. Justin Lee's Torn. What is his name out of Georgia? Gushy. Anyway, whatever. He's actually not even queer, but all this to say, there are a number of people who are writing on the topic and then looking at the reconciliation of these two sort of parts of people, and thinking about how, again, they're not mutually exclusive. They can live harmoniously. I think there are still tensions, but again, that's sort of for the person to figure out him or her or themselves. But for me, I absolutely just was like, I'm not interested in this anymore. I don't want this. I have no desire. But I think that we do find a lot of folks who, again, go from one religious orthodoxy to another religious tradition, that are typically more, affirming and welcoming, thank God. But again, it's just sort of, yeah, I don't know what the statistics are or what the sort of averages are of, how many people go, in which direction. But I know a number of folks who have taken either path or both paths.
We have another question from Zoom, which I will read. This is a question from Penelope. Is conversion therapy always rooted in Judeo-Christian values? And have you encountered any groups or institutions that do conversion therapy that are not based in religion, but rather with a more political basis, etc.?
Yeah, so I have thoughts about the term Judeo-Christian, but I'll put those aside for now. For both Jewish, traditions and also Christian traditions, these are perhaps the more, historically were the more advertised approaches, right? We can think of the Jonah, which was based in New Jersey. There was eventually a lawsuit against Jonah v. Ferguson, where Jonah lost. This was a Jewish organization that practiced conversion therapy, and they were sued on the basis of consumer fraud, which was like the smartest plan of attack for that lawsuit, and they lost. They're now out of business. But anyway, I think that the founder is now doing has founded another organization. But with that being said, and actually one of the contributors in the collection was a part of that lawsuit, and went to Jonah. But this idea, I mean, conversion practices were not actually originally from Christian or religious contexts, right? if we go back to the 1800s, where the words homosexual and heterosexual first come into any modern lexicon, or any lexicon, I should say, from that point forward, people started theorizing about these terms, right? Heterosexual, homosexual. Obviously, very quickly, homosexual was pathologized and seen as bad, and so people were like, "Oh, how do we figure out, cures to this? How do we address this? How do we change these people?" And of course, all these theories start cropping up. We can think of Freud and sort of, everyone's bisexual anyway. And then there's post-Freudian theories, and then people trying to address or build on these theories. And so, okay, in Canada, we can think of there was a doctor who performed forced castrations of queer folks, or queer men, should I say, specifically, and implanted what he believed to be, heterosexual testicles, supposedly heterosexual testicles. I mean, how did he know? But whatever, into these queer men, and then it thought that would be a way to change them. This is obviously a conversion practice. And again, that again originates in Canada. There are a bunch of medical practices. There was also, sort of psychological and psychiatric practices that believed that, an overbearing mother was the cause for, a young boy's homosexuality, or an absentee or emotionally distant father. And so these were theories that were then employed trying to change people. And again, electroshock therapy being a really popular method in secular or non-religious contexts. So what we see is a lot of conversion practice, or all of the conversion practices we're talking about today, are rooted in secular context, non-religious context. As for practices today that are still happening, this would probably be, again, I can think of in hospitals, if you're thinking about transphobic healthcare practices and not offering affirming care to these folks. I think that's considered a conversion practice, or that is a conversion practice and should be understood as such. We can think of, if we want to go back in time again, we can think of, the Nazis. These were politically motivated folks who allowed their ideology to frame how they understood and interacted with and tried to change queer populations. So I think there are a number of examples outside of religious contexts. But again, today, when we're thinking about conversion therapy, we're thinking specifically in Christian context, and then from there, perhaps Jewish, but also Muslim context. This is something that I wish I was able to have included in the collection, were Muslim stories, or stories from, Muslim authors or former Muslim authors. But I simply did not have the network or the connections to find anyone who was interested in sharing their story from these contexts. So the collection doesn't have that. But these are certainly practices that happen in Muslim contexts as well.
It's so interesting. I'm in education, that's where my work is, in education. And I was thinking, as you're talking about these new policies in formerly New Brunswick, but now certainly in Saskatchewan and Alberta, these policies that frame who is the right child for schooling as conversion practices. And I think it's really worthwhile, I think for education scholars in particular, to think about these bills as conversion practices. So thank you for making me think about that.
It's either let's email later, because I have some ideas as well. And there's someone I'm talking to right now about doing a little potential project together where we can talk all about this. I think both of these worlds collide. And right now, my research is actually in the educational context as well. I haven't talked about it, but I'll talk about it later with you. And I'd be more than excited to think about potential collaborations.
Yes, as a bisexual, I always say more is more.
That's it.
Well, I have a question for you, and it's not completely formed, but I'm wondering, so for people who were, fighting to get conversion therapy banned, was one of the arguments kind of like the Born That Way narrative? Are they using biological essentialist discourses to justify that? Because I'm not a huge fan of biological essentialist discourses. So how do you say things now? Do you know what I'm trying to?
Yes, I do. I think I think I know yes, I think. So people oftentimes will argue, okay, so if in fact we're not born this way, a la Lady Gaga, then that means that sexuality is fluid. And that's what all of these gender and sexuality theorists are claiming, that sexuality is fluid and it can change. And so is gender and all this kind of stuff, right? Which it's like, yeah, that is what we're saying. Like it is fluid and it can change. Doesn't mean it will, but it can, and sometimes does. And with that being said, they will then claim, wait a second, you're saying it changes. So that means you're for conversion therapy. And you're like, no, not a chance in hell, my friend. That's not what I said. The thing that I always say at this point in response to this comment, because I mean, you have, I somehow still have folks from these high control religious contexts that I'm in contact with, and we talk about these things. And so I'll say to them, there's a big difference between saying someone at any point in their life, whether it's when they're young, middle-aged, or older, that they realize or start to see a change in their sexual attractions, how they identify gender-wise, whatever. There's a big difference between you as a person coming to that realization naturally, sort of over time on your own terms, and then someone else saying, you need to fit this box, you need to change, you need to do this, this, and this. Those are two very different things, right? So maybe one day I'll become attracted to women. I welcome the opportunity, and it seems like an opportunity. Like you said, more is more. However, that's not where I'm at right now. I'm still a thorough homosexual, and that's that. If someone, though, again, says, you have to do this, you have to be this, that's the violence of conversion therapy, right? And I think that, and what the beauty of, again, sort of the field of gender and sexuality studies is that we recognize that it's possible on your own terms. And it's not like it's clearly not a choice. It's not like, oh, I've chosen this. It is just sort of what happens versus someone saying this has to happen. It is requisite, it is incumbent upon you to change. And if you don't, well, then there's going to be this consequence and this consequence. That's violent. That's not okay, right? And that's the big difference. Is that gesturing towards what?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I was reflecting as we were chatting, because in my one class this term, we're reading like What's Wrong with Becoming Queer by Weber, and we were talking about the ways in which like the Born This Way narrative, even though it can be politically useful sometimes, can really fail us, right? And not representing that kind of like fluidity that you just talked about. So yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks, Luke.
I remember when I was a kid, my first crushes were on girls. I remember my last crush was in grade 3 on Melanie Harding. I still remember her phone number. I only remember 3 phone numbers.
Give her a call.
And that Graham, her dad, still would probably pick up the phone because they still live there on Glen Davis. I remember 3 phone numbers: my childhood phone number, my current phone number, and Melanie Harding's phone number. I don't even remember my last cell phone number. I just remember Melanie's, mine, and my home number. And so Melanie was my last crush, pardon me as I choke on my words, my last girl, that was not intentional, as like my last girl crush. And she, again, like I remember having those feelings that I now feel for men, but for Melanie. And I remember Rachel Bell having a crush on her. I remember having a crush on Laura at the cottage, whatever her last name was, right? All of these, again, these are like, whenever you remember kids' names or your names from when you were a kid, you always use the last name too, right? Anywho, so these are I remember this. And so when I was in conversion therapy, I would bring this up and Dane would be like, good. See, you do have like that attraction. It's just lost. You just need to get back to it. But it's, again, for me, it's not like one day I woke up and I was like, you know what? It's going to be really cool in grade 4 to be attracted to the other guys in my class. Like, I can't wait to tell everyone I have a crush on Jeff Haig. No, that wasn't a cool thing to do. And so again, this idea that like, for me, it just happened, and that's the way it is. And I'm cool with it, obviously, but this is what conversion therapists do. They try to take that idea. Oh, see, even the left, even the progressives are saying that it's changeable. It's like, yeah, it's changeable. But again, how it changes is the question. And so that's just what comes to mind.
Well, anybody else online?
I'm not seeing another question online, but it's also a good time to add one if you have got one.
It's a great time to add one if you got one.
Another question here.
Oh, we got another question. All right. Please.
I'm sorry, this is a quick one. I'm wondering if there's any overlap in the literature with Two-Spirit on queer Indigenous survivors of residential schools and survivors of conversion therapy. If there's any, talking across there.
You know what? This is something I have thought about in a different context. So most of my past research was on the intergenerational transmission of trauma between Holocaust survivors, their kids, and their grandkids. And I was like I was mostly in literature or in English departments. But I eventually switched to history and creative writing and a bunch of other stuff at this point. But for me, I was always interested in the similarities between descendants of residential schools and the descendants of Holocaust survivors. I've never thought about this question though, or sorry, I've never thought about pursuing this question though, specifically the idea of residential school survivors, 2S residential school survivors and conversion therapy survivors. It would be quite a small population, obviously, though not what's the word? Obviously, still an existing population, but I think it'd be quite difficult to find a lot of folks who not only fit the bill, who are Two-Spirit and residential school survivors, but then on top of that, those who are willing to talk. But it's something that I think would be like a really needed what's the word? It's really necessary research, but I don't know anyone who's doing it, and I don't know anyone who's thought about this to date. But that's actually like a phenomenal that's a phenomenal question.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because when we're thinking about like conversion practices, it makes me and white settler colonialism, it reminds me of like Kim Tallbear's work around like settler sexuality and like this like the institutionalization of settler sexuality through, for example, residential schools can definitely be understood, I think, through that framework of like conversion practice as colonial practice.
Yeah, I think so. I think of high control Christianity as a colonizing effort, right? These
Yeah.
are folks who want the entire world to be self-similar. They want everyone to look like them, to act like them, to, walk like them and do what they do. They want everyone to believe what they believe. This is an effort to see any sort of diversity as a threat and to colonize diversity, colonize any other group who's different from them, and to, again, to make them self-similar. Conversion therapy is just an extension of that in these religious, contexts, right? They're trying to make everyone to be heteronormative or heterosexual subjects. And so I think that all of this is fitting together under the rubric of colonization and, this idea of like trying to change people to be self-similar. But no, I've not heard of any research on the topic. I would be fascinated to read research on the topic.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think looking at day schools too, which have closed much, much more recently, would be worthwhile looking at as well in terms of conversion practices.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, good question.
Good question.
All right, so I think that probably takes us to the end of our conversation. We appreciate so much the questions that folks have offered. Celeste and I got a lot out of this conversation, and we suspect that the audience has as well. We want to extend our heartfelt appreciation to everyone for taking the time to attend our event, and a special thank you to Luke for sharing this work with all of us. So again, Luke's book is called Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy, and we encourage you to check it out of your library or pick it up at an independent local bookshop. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Luke. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Celeste. Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, everyone, also for their questions and joining us this afternoon. We're going to be closing up the Zoom and the live stream now, but this does remain available on our YouTube channel, and you should revisit it and you should share it. You should also have a wonderful weekend. Bye.
Thank you.